Hello and welcome to this video in which I will talk about development for Microsoft Dynamics 365 Business Central, which is done in Visual Studio Code. The goal of this video is for you to learn about Visual Studio Code, or VS Code for short, and all the important elements of the AL language. I will show you everything that you need to know about as a starting point for you to become an effective and efficient AL developer. If you follow along with my demos, you will create your very first extension for Business Central over the next couple of hours. My name is Daniel Rimmelswam, and I am a partner with Cloud Ready Software, one of the ISV development centers who can help you with just about anything related to Microsoft Dynamics 365 Business Central. We have four main objectives. In the video titled Setting Up Visual Studio Code for Dynamics 365, I showed you in detail how to set up and configure your development environment for Visual Studio Code. In the first section of this video, I will quickly recap this information. And before we get started, we will create the workspace together. In the second section, I will introduce you to all the object types in the AL language, and we will create a very simple extension together. You will also see the in-client designer, which is a visual development tool inside the Business Central web client that you can use to help create page extensions. The third section shows a few ways to enhance your extension. We will look at the debugger, we will see how translations work, I'll show you how to use dependencies between apps, and finally we'll take a look at some of the new .NET Wrapper data types. In the final section, I will cover connecting to the outside world and the technical aspects of converting your CAL objects to AL. This last topic is also covered in much more detail in the video titled Migrate Your IP to Visual Studio Code. So let's get started. The first section will cover setting up the development environment. And as I've said in the introduction, there is another video about setting up Visual Studio for Dynamics 365 Business Central. But let's recap this real quick. The easiest way to set up a development environment is to use one of the Azure BM templates to create a sandbox. Before Business Central was released, we used a template to create what was called a developer preview, in which we were able to do development and testing for Business Central apps. So now that Business Central has been released, Microsoft has new templates to create these sandboxes, and those new templates are available from the aka.ms link on your screen. The nice thing about those Azure VMs is that everything that you need is pre-installed, and there's not a lot you have to do to make it work. If you really want to have your development environment locally, or in a local virtual machine, you will need to prepare your environment yourself. First, you will need to prepare your machine for Docker. This can be done in Windows 10, but it is easier to use Windows Server instead. For instance, I have my personal development environment in a local VM on Hyper-V, with Windows Server 2016 as the operating system, and I use those VM snapshots to be able to easily revert back to a previous working system in case I screw something up. But for this video, we have an Azure VM, so I'll show you around in the next demo. Next, you'll need the nav container helper PowerShell module, which in the Azure VM is already pre-installed. Managing all sorts of things for NAV can be done using PowerShell. But since Microsoft is now deploying all those Business Central builds on Docker, they've also provided a PowerShell module that allows us to use the PowerShell command list from inside the Docker container from, PowerShell ISE window outside of the container. So you don't have to go into the container in order to be able to run those, because the PowerShell works from outside the container, from the host, and even remotely. So the nav container helper module provides command lists for a variety of purposes, and they really make life so much easier for AL development. Next element is Git. Visual Studio Code is natively integrated with Git, but it is not part of the install. So when Visual Studio Code is installed, it does not automatically also include the installation of Git. So to make Git work, you will need to install it yourself. Lucky for you, when you open VS Code and Git is not installed yet, first thing that VS Code does is check if Git is available, and it'll give you a message that it's not, and it'll give you a button that you can click, and I'll show you how that works. So we'll set that up together. In order to be able to communicate with a remote repository through Git, you'll need to set the global name and email address system settings. And probably the most important of all, you need to use a valid NAV partner development license. Without that, you're out of luck unless you want to do development for particular customers yourself. So the reason is each partner gets their own number range for objects, and those number ranges are set inside of the developer license. And so by using a developer license, it sets up whether you're allowed to create objects in those number ranges. And so for customer-specific apps in the 50,000 range, you still need a proper developer license because only a partner license gives you access to those numbers. So, it really depends on what you want to do with it, but at the very least, you need a proper developer license. So all the elements for a Business Central development are contained within what's called a Docker container. Now, I'm not going to go deep into Docker. We have a video about deploying your development environment using Docker. And in that video, we go into deep detail and very deep dive into how Docker works, how it's all set up. But the thing that you need to know is that these Docker containers are based on an image. So the image is downloaded to your host, and then a container is created based on that image. And so every time that you create a container, it doesn't need to create like the whole image again. It only uses part of that image as like a template for the new container. So it's very effective and very efficient. Downloading the image might take a half an hour, but once the image is downloaded onto your host, you can create a new container within a matter of minutes. And so the container includes a web client, a Windows client, C-side, PowerShell, command prompt, nav container helper, and there's a specific folder that you can use to share files between the host and the container. And I'll show you how that all works. Of course, the next element is Visual Studio Code itself, also known as VS Code. And what makes VS Code so powerful are the extensions. So VS Code is a lightweight developer tool that you can make work with certain languages by installing extensions for Visual Studio Code. And so for this, you can watch the setting up VS Code for Business Central, and also a video about tips and tricks. And so in the tips and tricks video, I'll go into all sorts of cool detail of new extensions and how you can, improve your developer experience. You can get quite fancy with this. It is really cool how it all works, and I am really excited about seeing how this, develops. Source code management, I've mentioned this before. Git is integrated in VS Code. You can also add a extension for Visual Studio Code into team services, for instance, or any other type of ticketing system. There are a number of extensions for a number of different systems. So I like to use VSTS because I'm used to it. We use Git repos in VSTS for work items and for linking check-ins and commits to work items. So it's very useful. I like it. In the tips and tricks, we'll go into more detail on how that can be done. We also have a video about source code management specifically. So therefore, I'm not going to go into much detail. In fact, I don't think we'll cover source code management itself very much at all in this video. But you can watch the source code management video if you want to know more about that. So our approach, the development approach, is to have one of a decentralized development approach, which means that we don't connect to a common database with the whole development team. So if I have 5 developers, we don't have one development database and all 5 developers connect to that same system. Every developer has their own local instance of the development environment. And by using source code management, by using Docker containers, this is actually very easy to set up by some very easy scripts. And then all you need to do is link to your source code management repository, which downloads all the files to a local folder. Then you run a script to create the Docker container, and your workspace is off to the races, and you can start doing your own development. And you don't have to take care of any version tags and things like that. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself, or at least I'm getting excited about this topic because it's really cool. Unfortunately, it's not for this video. So Visual Studio Code, VS Code, is about files in workspaces. So a file is always in a specific language mode, which is detected from the file extension. So AL objects have an extension .al. So you have customer card.al. That .al makes it an AL file, which Visual Studio Code will recognize because you have an AL language extension installed. And because it's an AL file, it recognizes it as an AL object. A PS1 file is a PowerShell file, etc., etc. The main project folder is referred to as the workspace. So the workspace with the files is the principal way of working with VS Code. And so you can actually look at the Explorer section in Visual Studio Code. You can have Windows Explorer right next to it. When you create a new object in VS Code, you will see the file show up and vice versa. So you can create a new file in Windows Explorer and you can see it appear in VS Code automatically. Then we have something called the command palette. VS Code works with a command palette. The access to the command palette is Control-Shift+P. If you do Control-P without the Shift, you go to File, which has this little greater than character. I'll show you how that works. It's really cool how just by typing the greater than signal, it goes into a different mode of the same text box. It's really slick once you see it. There's a small selection of menus. There are no toolbars, ribbons, or icons except for what's in the activity bar. And another thing that makes VS Code really powerful is code snippets. So code snippets are like little pieces of code with placeholders. So as a CAL developer, you probably have a lot of times where you have, like a find set and then a repeat until next equals 0. That stuff can all be in code snippets, and it makes it really efficient. So as we go through all the objects today, I'll use snippets. I'll show you how to use snippets. And if you want to see how snippets are created, go take a look at the tips and tricks, best practices in Visual Studio Code video, where we go into snippets and how to create them. And there's even an extension in VS Code that will help you create snippets efficiently. Configuration is done in JSON files. So whenever you go into the settings of the program, you set a setting or you change a setting, that modified setting is saved in a file, and the language of those configuration files is JSON. So JSON is JavaScript object notation, and there are a number of configuration file in JSON format, like settings.json, the language.json, launch.json, app.json, and as we go through this whole exercise, you'll see what those files mean. So right now, maybe you're confused as heck, but trust me, at the end of this video, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. Again, source control integration, integrated support for Git, supports many repositories and providers. I already covered Git a little bit. As long as it's a Git repository, like on GitHub or Bitbucket or VSTS, or maybe you have a privately hosted repo. TFS, I think, can be set up to have Git repositories as well. So as long as you can connect to it, as long as it's configured as a Git repository, you can have that as a repo in VS Code. So this is the Visual Studio Code anatomy. This is the screen, what it looks like. First, you have the menu. As you can see, there's only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 selections on the menu. It's very limited. They really wanted to keep it clean. The next is the activity bar. So there's 5 selections on there. The top is the Explorer. That's where you'll see the folders and the files in your workspace. Then we have search. And then we have the third is the Git integration. Then we have the debugger. And then finally, there's the extensions list. So you can see all the extensions that are installed in your VS Code. The status bar at the bottom can have different colors. So by default, it's blue. At some point, it turns to purple when Git is installed. It can be yellow or red or orange, depending on different states. And depending on the extension that's in use, you can see various different ways of interacting with the system. So when you're in source code control, it'll show you if there's a commit that's ready to be uploaded, if there's issues in there. It all shows up in the status bar. As we're going through these objects, if there's something interesting to point out about the status bar, I'll show you. Then the middle is the text editor. It doesn't look like a text editor because it's not showing the text editing at the moment, but it'll become clear. And then finally, you'll see this is the command palette. This is where it all happens. So this is Control-Shift-P. That's the command palette. You'll see the greater than sign. You can actually backspace out of that, and it becomes an empty text box, and that changes it to the go to file. So especially if you have a workspace that has hundreds of files, it's really useful to have the search capabilities within the command palette. So what makes VS Code useful for us as AL developers? Well, that's the AL language extension. And so the language extension for AL for VS Code is an extension with which you create objects for Dynamics NAV and Dynamics 365 Business Central. It has capabilities of writing and interpreting AL code. It has syntax highlighting, which means that different keywords get different colors based on the function of that keyword. It has IntelliSense, so it is context aware. It knows where you are and what the capabilities or what the options are at that point. So for instance, if you're in an empty file, you want to create an AL object, it knows, okay, well, you're in an empty file, so you can create a table or a page or an XML port, etc. And so if you're in a table object and you're in the fields area, it knows that you can have, a field snippet. So it knows by way of context what you can do. And so it's IntelliSense. And so you can auto-complete something that you're typing. You can do control space to force it to show you what's available at that point. Next thing is the compilation errors and warnings. This is real time. So it will tell you warnings and errors as you're typing. So as you're writing code, as you're creating an object, it will tell you in the problems window what you're not doing right. And so it is quicker than you can type. So sometimes that's annoying because, as you're typing the word code unit, by the time that you've typed the U, it says unrecognizable object format. And so, it's sometimes it's even a little bit too quick, but that's pretty cool. You can also deploy to Dynamics NAV or 365 Business Central service tier from VS Code. AL language provides a way to automate the creation of a workspace. So you can create workspaces from the ground up, but there's also a command in there called AL:go. Under the command palette, Control-Shift-P, and then you enter AL.go, and then it will ask you for a folder, and it will create the workspace with configuration files for you, and then you can get started. So without further ado, let's have a look around and we will create our first workspace. So this is my Azure BM. I've created this by using one of those templates. And within that template, it creates a container called nav server. So you'll see a group of shortcuts with nav server. So I have a PowerShell prompt, nav server web client, nav server Windows client, nav server C side. Those are all connected to the Docker container that is called nav server. And so all the elements that I need to do development on nav server are available. The other part that I've mentioned is the nav container helper. So that's a PowerShell module that has functions for container handling, for object handling, for app handling, etc. I'm not going to go into the details for this because we're not going to use much of it. You can watch the video about setting up VS Code for Dynamics 365 Business Central. You can also watch the Docker video in which we are going to go into deep detail for that. The other part is the PowerShell ISE. Not for this particular video. I'll show a little bit about it in the migration scripts, but just to show you that it's preloaded. If I go here and I say, for instance, new nav container, you'll see that the nav container helper objects are already preloaded, so I don't have to do anything to load this into memory. It's already part of the Azure VM, so that's very handy. You don't have to do the loading of the commandlets. So another important part is the landing page. The landing page on the Azure VM has a bunch of information that is very important. This is the insider build number that I'm using for this Azure VM. I have this version of the AL language installed, and if you click this, it'll download the v6 package that you can then install in VS Code. So that's not a topic for this video, but if you have a container like this with a particular number, it comes with a particular version of VS Code that is supposed to be able to work together. Another part that's important, if you create your Azure VM, you have to wait until this message appears before you even try to connect. If you connect to the VM before that message, you can actually mess up the VM itself. So when it's all the way down, starting initialization, at some point it says container setup complete. You think, I'm going to connect, but as soon as you're connecting, it's still running a script in the background. So you can screw that up if you don't, if you connect. So don't connect until you get that completion in your screen. That's it. So now we go into Visual Studio Code. And as you will see, the first thing that it does is it checks for Git. If you don't install Git, Git is not necessary for what we are going to do today, but I don't like this message and it's easy to get rid of it. So just click on download Git. That opens this website. Then you say download for Windows, and then you say run, and then it downloads, and then it comes up with the installation wizard, and then you click on next 9 times. So this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then it is install, and then it's going to run, and then it's going to complete. Then we uncheck view release notes, we hit finish, and now it's done. So then we click this guy, and we restart Visual Studio Code. And you'll see looking for Git, it's finding Git, so now everything is peachy. We're not going to get this warning again. So this is Visual Studio Code. Here is the menu bar with very small selection, and this is the activity bar with the Explorer on the top. Then search, then source control, then the debugger, and then extensions. And as we're going to work through all the labs today, we are going to use most of these things. So I'm not going to talk about all of them right now, but one thing that you will want to know is the command palette. So I am hitting Shift Control P, and that opens the command palette. And as you can see, there's the greater than. If I delete backspace, the greater than, we go to file. It doesn't do much now because I don't have a workspace with a bunch of files, so I can't really show what is in here. I can do a question mark, and you can see the kind of stuff that you can do. If I do the greater than, it goes back into the command palette. So the first command, by the way, if I go into extensions, the only thing I have installed at this moment is AL language, and I also still have PowerShell installed. I thought I cleaned up my environment completely, but I haven't. So PowerShell is still installed. So normally you will not see PowerShell. That'll not be part of it, but in the Azure VM, this AL language is already pre-installed. And if you're doing this locally, you're going to want to download the v6 from your landing page, and then go in here, Control P, and then do v6, install from v6. you point to the file, and then it's self-explanatory. It's really easy to do that. So let's do AL-go, and then it's going to ask for a folder. So I have a folder on the C drive called My Demos, and I'm going to call this Bookshelf because our extension is for the bookshelf. So as you can see, it automatically creates a workspace for me. It asks, do you want to go to a cloud sandbox or your own server? We're all local here, so we click our own server. And what that does is it creates a couple of files. And so it's now asking for the server name requires authentication because it's now trying to go to localhost. Let's escape out of this. And let me just show you all the files that are part of this workspace. So first of all, let me open Windows Explorer. I go to local disk, I go to my demos, and never mind the other couple of folders, those are demos for later. This is the bookshelf workspace that I've just created. And it has a folder called VS Code. It has an app.json and hello world.al. And in the VS Code folder, there's a launch.json. So if I go into those files from Visual Studio Code, hello world.al is an AL file, so it has the extension AL. So now with syntax highlighting, you see that it is interpreting the syntax of the object based on the AL language. So we have an app.json, which if you've worked with extensions v1, you know that in order to create a navix file, you have to have a manifest. And so this is the manifest file. So let's put something in the publisher. I work for Cloud Ready Software. And I'm going to give this the name Awesome Bookshelf. Awesome Bookshelf. As you can see, the ID range by default is 50,100 till 50,149. That's the default values. If you have a developer license with a number range for an add-on, you'll have these different values. And so that license is loaded into the container, and you would have to change that. So Control S saves the file. Then we're going to go to launch. Launch is the connection information to the service tier. And so here we have to go into the landing page again to copy specific connection information. So at the bottom, there's a piece that is important for launch.json. So you just select those 4 lines and you do Control C, just copy them. And then in your launch.json, you'll see 3 lines here that have the same kind of thing. So server, server instance, and authentication over here. Server, server instance, and authentication. And also the tenant is blank here. And so in the launch.json in your Visual Studio workspace, just paste that right in here. And then as soon as you save this, it'll know that it has to connect to this guy. So looking at Hello World, which is red, you see these squiggly lines. It says the target page customer list for the extension object is not found. Now, sometimes when you save the launch.json, it checks and looks for symbols, and it can't find the symbols. And so one thing that we have to do is download the symbols to the workspace in order for us to program against the reference of the service tier. And so it's not asking for it, nor sometimes when you reopen, let's reopen the workspace, see what happens. So if I go to Visual Studio Code, it opens that workspace again because that was the last workspace that you've used. So now you get a message here that says symbols are missing. You can click on download symbols. You can also do Control-Shift-P and do download symbols and then select that. So whether you select this command in the command palette or if you click on this button, it's going to do the same. So now it's going to authenticate against the system that we've set up in launch.json. So it's asking for a username. In my case, that's Zenster. And my password is some secret password. And so now it's going to go into the service tier to get the symbols down. And so now I get a message that says symbols have been downloaded. If I go into the AL packages folder, I can see 2 app files. And so I can tell you that these 2 app files are actually extension files. So once we start publishing our app into the service tier, the system will generate an app file, and that app file is a different app that is going to go into the service tier. And so it's the same thing as what is here. So the app files for the system itself is now part of my workspace, and now there are no more problems. So if I click on problems, it says no problems have been detected in the workspace, and the customer list is no longer marked as something that it can't find, because the reference to the customer list is now part of our workspace. So that's it. We now have a workspace with which we can start doing development. So let's go back to our presentation, and we are going to go into the next section, developing your first extension. In essence, developing in AL comes down to 3 parts. First, it is about defining the data model. Second, it's about presenting the data in the user experience. And third, it's writing code into methods and attributes and functionality that can be used by the user. So let's go into the first item, which is defining the data model. So there are 2 object types that you can use to define the data model. One is a table object, which is defined by new table objects for your extension. So your extension will have new tables that don't exist in the base app. Those are table objects. And then the second part is table extension object, and those are used to modify and extend existing table objects. And so we're going to create one of each in the next few minutes. We're going to create an actual table and an actual table extension objects. And so you can't actually go into the table and modify it, but you can add to the table object that's in the standard base app. And so a few things that you can do there: you can add fields, you can modify certain properties, you can add triggers to the table extension object that automatically subscribe to events in the table object of the base app. And we're going to create examples of those. So first, creating tables. The object is a table object. The snippet that we can use is the T-table snippet or the T-field snippet for the fields. So the T-table snippet is for the object itself, and the field is for the fields inside it. You can declare properties and fields and keys and code, and in the code you can have triggers and procedures. So the triggers are really the table triggers. So you'll have on insert, on modify, etc. And then you also have validation field triggers. And then obviously you can create procedures as well. The second data object is extending existing tables, which is done by the object called table extension. There's a snippet for it called tTableExt. Possible changes that you can do is you can add fields to the base table, which will have to get your custom field numbers. You can add keys. You can add trigger logic for insert, modify, delete, and rename, which automatically subscribe to the insert, modify, delete, and rename events of the original base object in the base app. Plus, you can modify existing fields where you can change certain properties. You can insert triggers on before validate, on after validate by adding triggers to the fields itself. It looks the same as the triggers in table objects, only they subscribe to the validation trigger of the base table. So you can see a full list if you follow the link at the bottom of your screen. And we are going to go back into our Azure VM to see if we can make this work. So we are back in our bookshelf workspace. First thing we're going to do is we're going to get rid of Hello World. We don't need Hello World. We're going to create our own. Now we have a poorly configured workspace because it doesn't have an AL file. So every workspace for AL needs to have at least one AL file. So one way to create a file is on the File menu, you click New File. You can do New File by doing Control-N, which will put it in the folder that you've selected. So if I click on AL Packages and then I click Control-N, it'll create a new file in the AL Packages folder. That's not where I want it. I just want it in the root. So you can also click on the New File button, which is what I like to use because then you get to insert or create a file name right away. So we're going to create a new table called Book. And then you have to give it the extension .al. And that defines for the system, I'm going to create an AL file. So now, at the bottom of your screen in the status bar, you see that the language mode of my file is now AL. If I click on app.json, it says it's a JSON file. If I had a PS1 file in my workspace, it would say PowerShell, etc., etc. So now, because it's a .al file, it'll recognize it as an AL in the language mode. And also when you hover over it, in the My Demos folder, in the bookshelf folder, you can actually browse to it too if you want to show, if you want to see that. My Demos in the bookshelf. I now have a file called book.al. So you can actually open this with Notepad, and it's empty right now. I can save it, and it goes right in there. It doesn't recognize it because that's not AL. So now this is a empty AL file, and we can create a new object. So I can look at IntelliSense by doing Control Space, and it tells me that I can do a number of things. So I can do this myself. I can define it as I'm going, but I can also use a snippet. So I can go in here, you'll see table. So if I do table and I give it a number and a name, etc., I can actually create this from scratch. And you'll see that right away at the bottom here, it says a bunch of different things. So integer literal expected, identifier expected, curly braces expected. So immediately as you're typing, you already know that you're not done yet. So on one hand, it's annoying because you know that you're not done. But on the other hand, it's also really great because you don't have to save it and compile it in order for you to know that something's wrong. So I'm going to use the table snippets. And the table snippet is T table. So all these snippets, they start with T and then the object or the thing that you want to do. And so you'll see over here, it says snippet, table AL language. So when I select that, it creates something that resembles an object in AL. And as you can see, there are a few things that are like almost highlighted. So now it's highlighting ID, my table, and my field, and integer, and PK, and field, and true, etc. All those things are placeholders. So what I'm doing now is I'm doing tab, which goes to the next placeholder. I go tab, and it goes to the next placeholder. I do shift tab, it goes to the previous placeholder. I do shift tab, and I go to the ID. Now I do arrow down. Now it exits the snippet. So if I do tab now, it actually types the tab. So you have to be careful with what you're doing with these snippets. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to select everything and delete. I do T table, table snippet. I do enter, and now it's asking me for an ID. So if you remember, the app.json said the number range is 50,100. That's my number. My table, I'm going to call it book. And now I have a field. And so my field, my first field is, it's an NAV table. So you have to give it a number. By the way, did you see how when I typed the first double quotes, it put the double quotes, the closing double quote in there immediately. And when I typed another double quote, it didn't type an extra double quote, but it just jumped over the closing double quote. That's how the text editor is also smart. So now I've given it a name, field name. I tab to the field data type, and of course that's code. Code 20. And then I go to tab, and it jumps right into the properties. Let's see if there's another tab. It goes to the PK, that's the key number, and then it goes to the key properties. So automatically it puts that number, because that's the first field that you enter as the primary key. Clustered is always true, so let's select true, and then it goes into the variable, which I don't really like at this point, because usually you don't start create by your table creation by entering variables and that sort of thing. So what I usually do is go into the variables and the triggers, and I'm just going to get rid of triggers. Don't forget, what we're doing here is we're working with a text file. So this text file, that's all it is. It's just text. And so you can do any text in there that you want. As long as it's part of the AL file, it'll be interpreted as such. Next, I'm going to add a new field. So what you can do is you can do field and create your own field from scratch, but you can also go and say T field, and you see that there's a number of snippets for it. So I'm going to create a number of new fields, and I know what type of fields I want to create. So my next field that I'm creating is called title, and it is of type text50. So it is a T field text. So if I do T field text, it immediately creates a field of type text. I give it a number. So this is field number 2. My field is title. Is hey, see what happened now? What happened is IntelliSense recognized something that I typed, and I pressed enter, and that created another piece of code for me. So I don't want this, and so what you want to do is Control Z. But in Control Z, now I'm in tab mode, so that takes me out of my snippet. So you have to kind of be aware of what you're doing. So let's recreate that T field, and then it's text. Field number 2 is title. See, so I have title, and it thinks I want to use the isEmptyElse snippet. I don't, so I escape out of this, and then I do tab, and now it goes right into the length. I want to do 50. That's it. And then it goes into the properties. And so now it thinks, okay, you want to add some sort of property. I don't want to add some sort of property. I just want to create the next few fields. So I'm going to pause the video, and I'm going to add 3 more fields real quick, and then I'm going to start the video again. So I have 2 more fields, and I wanted to show you actually one more thing about the field snippets. So T field. I want to create a Boolean field. So for Boolean, there's no field snippet. And now I want to create an integer field, and there's also no snippet. So you can just use the regular field snippet, which creates something else. So here I want to create field number 5, and that is called page count. And that is an integer. And now part of this snippet is it provides another property placeholder. So one of the things that you'll find as far as issues in the AL language is that not all of the snippets are aligned in the way that they work. So the nice thing about that is that you can actually go in there and modify the snippets the way that you want them. So it's really versatile in that. One other thing that I wanted to show you, and I need to expand this to full screen and let's turn this thing off. Each field, I want to provide every field with a caption. And so you can go in here and hit enter and then do caption, and then you'd say equals, and then you say number, and then like that. There's another really cool trick is where you can do selection, multi-select. So I put my cursor at this curly brace here, and now I'm holding down the Alt key, and then I'm also clicking after each of the other curly braces, and now I'm releasing the Alt key. And as you can see, there's a blinking cursor in 4 different locations. So now I hit enter, and it enters a new line on all 4 of those spots. Now I do caption, and it enters that same thing on all 4 spots. So as I'm typing this, now I have caption for every line, and all I need to do is, so then you escape out of it to actually enter the value. Title, author, hardcover, page count. And then we save it, and then we're done with that one, right? This is our table object. So we have a new table called book. We have a number of fields, and we have a key, and we have a bunch of triggers that we don't use. By the way, I deleted those because this is just a text file. I can go in here and create a new trigger, and it will show me what kind of triggers I can actually create here. So I have an on, delete, on, insert, on, etc. triggers that you can add to a table object, because that's part of the AL language understanding of what a table object is supposed to be. So you can't on Daniel, that doesn't exist. So you can only create triggers in events that are defined as part of the object definition. Next, we're going to create a table extension. So we click New File, and we are going to create the customer book extension.al, which creates a new file. And in there, we are going to create a table extension. So again, we can do table extension and build it from scratch. We can also do the table extension snippet. So this is a different table or a different object type than book than the table. So I can use 50,100 again, my extension, or that's the name. So customer book extension extends the customer table. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a field to the customer table for favorite book, and I'm going to link that to the book table. So as you can see, I have an ID for the object, I have a name for the object, and now it says, what do you want to extend? I want to extend the customer table. And so as I'm typing, IntelliSense suggests all the things that have that customer thing in it. So the word customer as part of the name of things that I can select. And so this is very powerful because this is the reference that we're talking about. So if you were to create an app that is an extension of another app, all you would need to do is have that app reference inside of your workspace, and it would recognize those names. So I'm selecting this customer, and then it's going to go into the next placeholder. Add changes to table fields here. So now we're going to the field. What do I want to do? I want to do favorite book number. So as you can remember, the book's number field was code 20. So I'm going to add a field code snippet, and I'm going to give it number 50,100. My field is my favorite book number. So this is not really part of this video, but when you create an app that's going to go into app source, you have to make every field that you add to base tables unique. And the way to do that is by generating an prefix or a suffix. And you have to go to Microsoft, to the guy that validates these apps, and you have to submit your request for a suffix or a prefix. So they keep track of those suffixes and prefixes. So let's say I want to use XYZ. In that case, I would say my favorite book number XYZ. Because there might be another guy creating another app that is also a bookshelf app, and they also want to add a field called favorite book number. And so this is a way to keep the names unique. So this is in advance of when they are going to get rid of the object IDs. You want to have unique names. For today, because we're the only ones, it's not really relevant, so I'm not going to put the prefixes in there. But when you do app development for AppSource, either XYZ as a pref or as a suffix, or XYZ as a prefix. Either one will work, but you have to register those. So then you tab into the next. That was code 20, and I don't want that property, and I don't want this variable. I will add the variable when I need it. So that's it. This is my table extension for the customer table. So I have added a table extension that extends the customer with an additional field. Oh, let's create the caption. Caption equals favorite book number. Right? That's it. That's all we need to do. We have a table and a table extension. And let's go back to our presentation. So what does this actually do in the database schema? When you add a table, it just adds the table itself. But for table extensions, before, what it did in V1, extensions V1, it would just add a field to a table. So the base table, the customer table in this instance, would get an extra field from a number of different extensions. And as you can remember from the old nav days, is that there was a limitation to the number of fields that you can add to each table. And so especially when you hit very popular tables like the sales line table and the purchase line table, when you add a number of these really big add-ons, you ran out of field space real quick. And so what they've done for extensions V2 is they have come up with a scheme where each base table gets a companion table. And so the data for the table extension is stored in a separate companion table. And so they are related to the table that they extend, but they make the extension compatible with multi-tenant databases. So each tenant can have their own tenant database with just the tables that are added for the apps that are installed for that tenant. So these companion tables are created at sync time. And what that looks like is, for instance, the customer, you have the number in the base, you have the name in the base, you have an extension companion table, that's the second line. So where the red one has customer, dollar, and then this funky number. The blue one has customer, dollar, and then a different funky number. They both have the same primary key as the base table, only they have those additional fields for those additional apps. So instead of shoe size, for our example, there would be a field for favorite book number. And so that shoe size for extension 1 was added to the customer table, and it gets an additional companion table for that app instead of an additional field for that app. So it's no longer adding and removing fields from the base table, it's creating additional companion table. What do you need to know? This only affects table extensions, not new tables. So new tables, when you give it the name book, it'll create a table called book. If you create a table extension for the book extension, what happens is AL doesn't change. It ceases at a single table. So if I create a variable based on the customer table, that favorite book number will be a field that you can program against, like instantly. And the companion table's naming is original $app ID. So the new schema sync process for extension adds the companion table, and it'll call it customer dollar and then app ID. Let me show you real quick where that app ID is. That is the app ID in app.json. So this is the funky number that the table would be called. So if I copy this, the new table would be customer dollar and that number. That would be the, this would be the table name. It gets funky colors now because it doesn't recognize it, but that's the customer table name. And of course, you get the company dollar and then customer, etc. So it'll adhere to those to that structure. Only the table name for that additional table extension object will get that ID, the app ID. That's it about the data structure. So let's go to the presenting the data. Presenting the data works with pages, page extensions, profile, and page customizations. So there's a difference between a page extension and a page customization. Then we have reports, XML ports, and queries. So those object types are all used to present the data to the user. Let's go into the first real important object type, which is the page. And the object is called page. You have two snippets for page creation. One is called tPage, which is for the object itself, and the other is tFieldPage, and that is for adding a field to the page. And then in the page object, you declare properties like page type or source table. You have an area called layout, and that's the representation of the data where you have areas and groups and parts and fields. Then you have actions, those are going on the ribbon and action item menu. And then you have code, so triggers and procedures. And so just like in C-side, you will remember what's available in C-side is also available in the AL object on a page object. The second type of object that is important for displaying data is the page extension object, which is used to extend existing pages. So the name of the object is page extension, and the snippet that we use is tPageExt. Possible changes that you can make are you can add a group or a field or a part or an action. What's important there is that you have to specify where to place it. So you have to define an anchor. And so you have the functions add first, add last. Those go into the fast tab. So you specify which fast tab that field needs to go into. And then you say either at the start of that fast tab or at the end of that fast tab. And then you can also specify particular fields where you want to place a new field, and then you use the add after or add before anchor. And so you define the anchor inside the parentheses. So in the screenshot you see here, add last general. That means go to the general fast tab and add my favorite book number to the end of that fast tab. I like to use the fast tab anchors because sometimes what happens is if you anchor your field to an existing field, it might happen that another page extension moves that field to a different fast tab. So if for you, the importance is that your new field goes into a particular fast tab, then you need to anchor it to the fast tab itself. If you want your field to follow another field, then you obviously anchor it to that field. So if you have, say, name, and then the standard object has name and name2, if you add name3 to it, and you always want to have name3 displayed right by name2, you just tell it to anchor it to name2, and if somebody else moves name2 to a different fast tab, your field will move to that other fast tab with it. The full list can be found in this link down here at the bottom. Let's go into the Workspace and see what it looks like to create a new page and a new page extension. So let's close the app.json and launch.json. Let's close the book and the customer extension, and let's create a new file. and we are going to create a book card. So book card.al. We're going to create 2 pages. One is a card page and one is a list page. So we go T page. So now I have T page is a snippet, T page of type list. There's no specific for card, so let's get the regular page snippet, and that already sets the default to card. So the book card object ID is again 50,100 because this is the first page that we create. Book card, the page type is card. The source table is book. And as you can see, IntelliSense now knows about the book table because we've added it in this workspace. And so it looks at the symbols and also at the other objects inside the workspace. And it doesn't matter in which folder. So you can have 10 different nesting folders in here. All the objects in those folders will be recognized as valid objects inside of this. So then we go into the group. So it jumps right from the page ID to the page name, page type, source table, and now it goes into the group. So we have a layout with an area, and now we're going to create a group. So just like standard objects, let's give this one a general. Then we go into the field. The first one that we want to show is the number, which is available. And then immediately you see an issue here where the source is displayed, but the name is not the same. So what I don't like about that is that I want to see if we can do this in a more efficient way. So let's add field, T page field. So T page field is, so to add a field to the page, it used to be called T field page. So T page field makes more sense. And now it puts the first placeholder in my field. So I can say number, and then I can say number again, and then it gives me field property with a field property value. So this is important. So that's it for the snippet. So anyway, one other thing I'd like to show you is you can also create a field yourself. And when you do this, so the second is the title. When I select that field from it, you see that immediately it puts the name and also the expression in there. So for me personally, creating the field on a page without the snippet is even faster than using the snippet because the snippet adds something to the field that I don't know if I'll always use. And I'll show you a trick to add what I need real quick anyway. So curly brace, and that's it for this guy. So then I want to add a group. So you want to make sure that you're in the right spot. And so you can see that when I move my cursor, right? So my cursor is here, and this marks like the curly brace close here and then the curly brace open there. So they are marked as they belong together. And so if I go down here, my cursor is at this curly brace, and then that curly brace is marked right there. So see how there's like a link between the two. So it makes it real easy to see where you are. So I want to add another group, and I want to call this details, curly brace open, and then I want to add the other 3 fields. So field, author, field, hardcover, field, page count. Okay, so now, just like remember in the table, I did multi-select, so I'm going to do the same thing, because what we need for every single field that we want to see is we need to have an application area, all. You can select a different application area, but using all will always show it. The other part that we need to take care of are captions for the groups. Caption equals, and so then that's the general, and that's details. So we save that. That's it for my layout. So it's a card type page. My source is the book table. And at this point, I don't have any actions or any variables. So I'm just going to delete this and save it. And now my book card is done. So I also want to do a list page, book list.al. And then I do want a page type of list, 50,101. And this is book list. Table name is book. And so I'm just going to kind of race through this one, like the source table we have the card page ID equals 50,101, although we do book card, that's better. Card page ID editable equals false. And then we're going to go into the repeater, and we are going to create some fields, field number, field title, field author, and then we're going to click, click, click. Application area equals all. I think this is all we need. I'm going to get rid of the fact boxes. I'm going to get rid of the actions. And I think, So as you can see, as you get a little more familiar with how you do this, you get real fast, real quick. And so I've done this a few times now, and doing development for a few apps. And I must say that initially, when I first started working with this, after having worked with Seaside for almost 2 decades, I am liking the flexibility and the efficiency with which I can program in VS Code much better than Seaside. In addition to which, I know that if I just take the time to really go into my snippets, I could probably make some improvements to the snippets in the system and create my own snippets. And what is also really cool is that the Microsoft development team is watching this GitHub repository for AL. And so you can actually go in there and ask questions. So when you go to the GitHub Microsoft AL, you can go into the issues area, and you can see a bunch of issues from the community where, for instance, let's just take one that was assigned to Rob Anderson. So missing a matching permission set. So I'm just picking a random issue. So Camille here has a question about a permission set, and Rob Anderson has been assigned by this person to take a look at this. And I can guarantee you within a day or two, there will be an issue or a resolution for it. So you can enter new issues. You can see and search. This is all searchable. So this is actually looking for open issues only. So you take this out. And for instance, you can go to translation, and it will show you all the issues that have the word translation in there. This is the actual repository that Microsoft is looking at. And so if you have a suggestion for making, for instance, the snippets better, you can actually clone this repository, make changes, and do a pull request. And they will look at the pull request. And if you make a really valid contribution to the snippet, for instance, then next week it'll be part of the project or part of the product. So you can actually make real contributions to the real product by looking at this. So, and if they don't take it, you can always have a personal snippet in your system. So that's it for my book card and book list. We need to create the customer book card extension. Oh yeah, we need to do a page extension. So let's create a page extension. We'll call it customer card book extension.al. T page extension snippet. This is 50,100 because it's my first page extension. We'll call it customer card book extension. Extends the customer card. And we're going to go into the layout. So what I want to do is I want to add the favorite book number to the end of the general tab. So I'm going to add the anchor here. So I can do Control Space, and this gives me all the pieces that I can enter. These are all the snippets, and these are the ads, right? So I can actually type add. Let's do add last. So to the end of the anchor. So now it's saying, okay, you need an anchor. Well, what anchors are available? Well, you do Control Space and you pick general. So you can only pick a valid fast tab for this. Isn't that great? It's just fantastic that you can only select from the list of things that are actually available. So then we're going to add the field, and we are going to add favorite book number to that field. We're going to add application area equals all. I don't have any actions or variables, so I can remove this. As you can see, I'm still used to this. Is so in my muscle memory. I did Control S and then I hit Enter from C side. Not necessary. You can just do Control C. So now that is saved as well. So let's see. I have the book. I have the book card, the book list, customer book extension, and we have the page extension. So that is all. That's all we needed for this step. And so let's go back to our presentation. The next thing you can do is customizing an existing page. And this is the only place where you would have two objects in a single file. And the reason is because what you need is a page customization object that is always linked to a profile. So you have to define a profile as well as a customization, and those always go together. And so that's one instance in which it's actually better to have two objects in one file. So the object is a page customization. The snippet is tPageCust. It must be published with a profile, and you can do the profile separately, but like I said, you just want to put it in there as a customization, including a profile. More restrictions than page extensions, so no variables, procedures, or triggers. And you can add changes to page layout and actions. It doesn't require an object ID, so it knows it doesn't need object ID to know what it needs to do. So let's go and create this. So we need a new file, customer list customization.al. So first we're going to create a profile, call it my profile. And in my profile, I have a description. I have a role center, and let's put this on the order processor role center, and customizations equals my customization. Now that doesn't exist yet. I'm just going to create it. So T page customization snippet, we're going to call it my customization. And see the squiggly line under customizations here went away as soon as you type that. And so it customizes the customer list. There we go. Right? And other than that, it works similar to a page extension. So let's say we want to make the responsibility center invisible. So modify responsibility center. And we want to say visibility equals false. So all that we are doing now is taking the responsibility center on the customer list and making it invisible for that profile. All that's left is to remove the things that we're not using. So let's delete this, and that's it for our customization. We're pretty much done with the first version of our app. So let's see if we can make this work. So what I want to do is I want to open the book list as the app is starting. So let's go into launch.json and paste the ID number of the book list into launch.json, save it, and then hit Control F5, which creates the package, and it starts Business Central. And it should open page 50,100. Yep, there we go. So we see the book list with the number and the title and the author. We just don't have any data in there. So let's create a couple of books. One, my first book, author, Daniel Reynolds-Swan. It's a pretty small book, just 100 pages. Let's create another book. My second book. That was a little bit bigger. Okay, so now let's go to the home page and go into the customer list. And let's see if we can open the customer card for Trey Research. And as you can see in the General tab at the end, we have a favorite book number. And there is a lookup in there, and I can select book number 2. So secretly, between finishing that application and showing it to you, I've added a table relationship because I couldn't look up the number. So in my customer card, my customer book extension, that's the table extension, I added a table relationship to the book number field. So it all works. So I'm happy to report that. So our base bookshelf app has a number of objects that all work, as we've seen. Now let's talk about extending application logic for a second. So what we've done so far is create a table extension object to add a field to an existing table. And we've had a page extension object that shows that field on an existing page. So it adds something to an existing object. But the primary means of really extending application logic, it happens through code units. And so real business logic is contained within code units, not in table or page objects. And those methods are then called from the table maybe, but the business logic itself should go into code units. Now, the matter of what goes into a code unit in what manner is a matter of design principles. And if you're interested in that topic, we also have a video on design patterns for Visual Studio Code in Business Central. Let's talk a little bit about the code unit object. The name of the object is code unit. There is a snippet, T code unit, that I don't find particularly useful because it adds an unrun trigger and a global variable, neither of which I often use. So I usually start with just a blank empty code unit, which is very easy to make because it's a very simple type of object, and I'll show you in a second. And so just like in C-side, you can set properties. The onRun trigger is optional, and you can create your own procedures. The procedure itself has a very useful snippet, and I'll show you in a minute as well. And in addition to simple types, we can now also return complex type, and some of the new complex types like JSON objects and XML objects, and even a .NET replacement variable types. Function types can be set through attributes, and that sounds a little bit strange, but I will show you in a minute what that means, especially for making a procedure a publisher or a subscriber is what those attributes are used for. Subscribing to an event publisher is done very easy. It's very easy to do. You declare a procedure. It's decorated with an event subscriber attribute, and then you use IntelliSense to complete the definition of the attribute and manually define the function parameters. So the snippet for these events are actually super useful, as you'll see in just a minute, because we're about to go into the demo. So first, we're going to create a new object, and it's going to be called customer code.al. And I'll show you the snippet. So T code unit, when I use this, see it creates an onRun trigger and it creates global variable, neither of which I'm a fan of. So I usually just start by typing code unit and then a number 50,100, customer code, curly braces, done. So this is my code unit. Easy enough, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to create a procedure. T procedure has a snippet, which is actually very useful. So what I want to do is have the ability to call this procedure from another object. So I don't need this to be local. I'm going to call it celebrate customer, and I am going to have a customer record. And I'm going to add another parameter, extra message, which is text. I guess the next tab stop is the variable, and I'm not using the variables either, so I'm going to get rid of that. This procedure just shows a message. With a message, whoa, we have a new customer. 2 new lines. And we are going to my customer.number, and we're going to put the extra message in there, and that's it. So this function displays a message. Now I want to do this as a result of when a customer is inserted. So I need to have a procedure that subscribes to that event. So for that, we have a snippet, T event, and you'll see that there are 3 event snippets. One is business, one is integration events. Those are both publisher event publishers, and then the sub is the subscriber. So watch what happens. First of all, it adds all these parameters, but it also adds a procedure. So you don't have to start with a procedure anymore. You can just use the event subscriber snippet, and that adds the procedure that you want to create. So what we want to do is subscribe to on after insert of the customer table. So we are going to select table. We are going to select database because we are going to the customer table. On some event, control space gives you the events that are available we're going to select on after insert. There is no element, so control space gives you nothing, but you can select nothing. And then we're skipping on missing license. We're skipping on missing permissions. And then we go into the procedure name. So we give it a meaningful name, customer on after insert. And that has a certain number of parameters. One is a variable called rec, and that is a record variable of customer. Tab goes into the code, and now what we're going to do is we're going to call the celebrate customer, and we are going to pass it rec, right? That's the customer, and we're going to congratulations from the code unit. So what we have is the subscriber that subscribes to the customer's on after insert, and we have a function celebrate customer that we call from that subscriber. So control F5. Click on new, click on customer, click OK, and now we have the message, whoa, we have a new customer, congratulations from the code unit. Pretty cool. So let's close this, and let's take a look at the next way to subscribe to a table trigger. So we already have a customer book extension, which extends the customer table. And inside there, we can actually create a trigger. And those triggers actually have predefined options. So you can subscribe to on after insert. So remember, this is a table extension. This extends the customer table. So what Microsoft has done is they have given us a way to actually subscribe to the standard table triggers by way of triggers of the table extension. So you don't have to any longer create a procedure in a code unit in order to subscribe to a table trigger. So on after insert, since we are already in the table extension, we don't have to give it any parameters. Those parameters are already part of the table trigger. So we do have a variable customer code of type code unit. All right, there it is, customer code. And then we're going to begin. Oh, one thing I wanted to show you real quick. See, I do begin. Watch what happens. I type the N, and that puts the end after the begin immediately. And when I hit enter, it indents it properly right away. So customer code dot celebrate customer, and now I'm going to send it rec and another message that says congratulations from the table extension. Right? Let's see if that works. Control F5. And we click on new. And then we click on customer. And then we click on OK. So first we get, whoa, we have a new customer. Congratulations from the table extension. So we now know that the table extension subscriber works. And we also have it from the code unit. So those are two different ways to accomplish the same goal, which is to subscribe to a table event by way of a code unit and also by way of a table extension. Our next topic is the in-app visual designer. So what is the in-app visual designer? Well, it is a what you see is what you get, or WYSIWYG editor for pages in Dynamics 365 Business Central. It allows creating and exporting and sharing simple changes of the user interface, and you can use it to simulate the web and the tablet and the phone experience, and I'll show you what that looks like in a minute. And it is powered by Extensions v2 technology, which means that all the changes that you put in the in-app visual designer are saved as an extension inside of your tenant. To access the in-app designer it's available from every page. So at the top, you hit the gear button. If you have the permissions, you click on designer, and that opens the simple design mode, which is the top one, where you just see designing the customer list. So for instance, I'm looking at the screenshot is of the customer list, and I clicked on designer, and that opened the simple design mode. Then you click on the more button, and that opens the advanced design mode. And so as you can see, there's a plus field that's highlighted. That is bright white. And then we have actions and parts and pages that are not so bright white. That means that those are not enabled yet. So the current version of the in-app visual designer only allows us to manipulate fields. And the features of this in-app designer is you can manage fields, which means you can hide fields, you can add fields from the table, you can rearrange fields on the page, also between fast tabs, and it works in repeaters and card type pages, etc. You can manage fast tabs themselves, like renaming them. So let's say you don't like the name general on the card pages, you can go in and change that name to something else. And what is really cool is it simulates different clients. So you can look at it as though you're in the web client. You can also click on the button to emulate the tablet client or the phone client, and the designer itself works within those experiences. And so I'll show you when we go take a look at that. You can also manage role centers, so you can reposition queue tiles, you can hide those queue tiles, you can hide queue groups, and that's all, part of the designer. So when you finish it, the customizations can be applied to all users of the current tenant. You can export it as a Visual Studio Code package, and in Dynamics 365, you can export it as a Dynamics 365 package. After the designer work is completed, the tenant will build it as an extension package, and it will publish and install the extension package for you. And it's quite tricky how that works, because you get a screen that says save, and if you don't save it, it saves it regardless, but it gives it a strange name. And so I'll show you where that all works. That's in the next screenshot also. These customizations can be exported and further edited. So when you click on the Stop Designing button, you get this Finish Up Design screen where you can enter a name for the extension and a publisher, and then you can hit the Save button. And I'll show you how that works. I could talk about it right now with the screenshot, but it's probably nicer to just show you. Downloading the source code can be done straight when you save it, but you can also later on go into extension management and then download the source from the extension management screen itself by clicking on the ellipsis and then clicking on download source. So what that does is it generates a zip file, and inside the zip file is essentially an AL workspace with an app.json and a launch.json and the page extension in a AL file. And so you right-click the extracted folder, and then you click Open with Code, or you drag the folder onto the Visual Studio Code editor, and then that opens. And then the really cool part is where you can publish and open it in the in-app designer from Visual Studio Code. So from within Visual Studio Code, you can hit F6. That opens the web client in design mode. Then you can, do all the changes that you want. And then you can go back into Visual Studio Code. You can hit F7, and that sucks those changes that you've just made out of the service tier into the objects that you've just modified. And so when you save it from within the web client, that updates your Visual Studio Workspace, and everything is synchronized. So let's go to the workspace, and I'll show you around. The first part that I want to show you is the web client itself. So when we go into the web client, I'm going to open the customer list. So I'm going to click on customers, and then we click the little gear over here, and then we click the designer. So this is the simple design, and when you move over these fields, you can see this tiny little triangle, and when you click on that triangle, you can set the freeze pane, or you can click remove. So let's remove the territory code. And when you click more, you can click on plus fields, and that opens the field list, and in here you can then drag fields from in here onto the page. So if I drag the chain name between the name and the phone number, and there it shows up. And so now when I click on stop designing, it gives me this dialog that says finish up design. You can click on this little guy, the X, and then you would expect it to cancel, but it doesn't cancel. It actually installs the extension with a funky name. So let's give it an extension name, Daniel's page changes, cloud ready software. Let's not download code. If you do download code now, it'll ask for a path, but when I click on save right now, it is publishing the extension behind the scenes. And when I go into extension management, it shows Daniel's page changes right here. Right, there it is. So now I can click this ellipsis and I can say download source. And now it says, do you want to save Daniel's page changes? Yep, let's save it. Let's just save it on the desktop. There it is. Let's extract it. Extract. See, there it is. That's your app.json. That's your VS Code folder. So if I drag this folder onto Visual Studio Code, it opens it as a workspace. And so you'll get a message pretty soon that says symbols are missing, so you would have to download the symbols, but launch.json is all prepared for connecting to that particular service tier in app.json. And I want to point this out because one thing that makes this kind of dangerous is that these page modifications from the in-app visual designer adds all the installed extensions currently in your tenant as dependencies. So as soon as you install one of those, it creates the dependencies on all the other apps as well. So it's kind of dangerous because this makes it difficult for the other extensions to be updated at the same time, because those will then depend on changes in the dependent apps. And so you're going to get unexpected interactions between those apps. So I'm personally not really a fan of this, although it's really cool. And especially the next demo is really awesome. And I love the way that it works because it gives you a visual way to interact with your page design. And that is really very useful, especially for people that don't have a mind for writing the code without visualizing where that code's going to end up. And so it helps me to visualize pages because I'm more of a visual person than a code person. So you can see here my awesome bookshelf is a dependency now. So if I were to make an update to awesome bookshelf, we would probably get some sort of conflict message that you can't update awesome bookshelf because there's a dependent app in there. So that's one of the things that I don't really like, but you need to be aware of that. So really what you want to do is go the other way and open the in-app designer from within Visual Studio Code. So what I'm going to do is I am going to uninstall. And I'm also going to unpublish. So now that's all gone. And what I'm going to do, by the way, one of the things that you could do is take this page extension and just put it in your workspace. And so this is extending the customer list. I have a customer card extension, right? That was 50100. I had a book list that was 50101. And that's one of the cool things. It does know what object number you're using, and it gets the next number. So really, if I were to use this, I would want to rename this. And so I would customer list book extension in keeping with the customer card book extension, and we're going to give it customer list book extension. And we get one issue here that we have a territory code that is not in the target. Well, let's see if we can do location code. Location code. There we go. Okay. So essentially what I've done is I've taken that page extension and I added it to my workspace. I don't need this anymore, so let's delete that. Now I want to open in the book list. So what I want to do now is open this in the in-app designer, and the shortcut for that was F6. So now it's going to create the package, and it's going to open Business Central in the in-app designer. So this is in design mode, as you can see. I want to add some fields. So I only have number and title and author. Let's do the page count. Come on. And let's add hardcover to it as well. So now we're done in here. We go back to Visual Studio Code. We hit F7. And now what it did is sending the request to the server, ready software, cloud ready software, and it says the latest changes from the server have been applied. So if I go to my book list, you can see that my number, title, and author are in there, and also my hardcover and my page count are in there, and my customer list book extension is still the same. So if I were to go in here and I go to customers, see, I'm still in design mode. I'll go to customers. All right, so I have chain name. Let's remove chain name. And let's add territory code. I clicked something twice. I'm not sure what happens here. Anyway, so let's go in here, hit F7, and see what happens there. Territory code was added after contact. Okay. So then stop designing. It already links to the awesome bookshelf, so it knows the context in which that's done. You hit save, and that should update everything. So now my workspace in Visual Studio Code is updated with the changes that I've done in the in-app designer. And that, I think, is pretty cool. So I think this is a really nice way of interacting with the system. So the tools are getting more and more useful. If you have trouble visualizing what your page extension or your page object will look like, you can actually have a visual designer where you can look at what it looks like. Oh, one other thing that I wanted to show you is when you click on more, you have here the desktop view and the tablet view, and it switches to what it looks like on a tablet, and the phone view, and it switches to what the phone view looks like. So if you click on this, you can also see what that looks like, and you can also add fields to it. and design it that way. So as you are doing the visual design, you can look at it from 3 different experiences. And I think that is probably the most useful feature of the in-app visual designer. So that's it. Let's go back to the presentation. With the in-app visual designer, we've come to the end of this video. In this video, we've looked at the overview of the development environment, a quick recap of the other video about setting up your Visual Studio Code, and the bulk of this video, we've talked about developing your first extension. Enhancing the extension and advanced topic will be covered in part 2 of this video. So let me just say, this is to be continued. If you want to learn more about Business Central apps, please follow the link on your screen. And all that's left for me is to say thank you for watching this. Thank you so much for your time, and have a nice day.